This is Urban Health Today, and I'm speaking with Dr. Luke Twelves, General Practitioner, Vice President of Medical for Lindus Health, and expert in diabetes research. He's here to talk about the lack of diversity in type 2 diabetes clinical trials and current initiatives to improve trial access. Thank you for speaking with me today, Dr. Twelves.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you.
And it's great to have you. All right, let's begin. Please talk about your background, your clinical trial work, and your work with Lindus Health.
I've been a family practitioner, general practitioner for over 20 years now. But throughout my clinical career, I've combined direct clinical practice with a portfolio career that's included research and the application of research to payer management, as well as the development of clinical software, and as well as running healthcare services directly in a management role. That focus has been, I say, on safety, on clinical research, and on the direct delivery of healthcare. I've been very fortunate over my career to work with some brilliant teams, both UK and internationally. I spent over a decade working for Optum and United Health in various different roles. I've worked at a local level with local healthcare providers. And I've also worked at national level. For example, I spent several years sitting on a technology appraisal panel for the National Institute of Clinical Health and Clinical Excellence. So throughout that time, I've either been delivering research or using research on a regular basis. And I've always come up against challenges. Research has been, you speak to researchers, it is not easy to deliver research. And it's not easy to deliver it cost effectively, fast, efficiently. And that is a universal problem. And as you look at clinical research and you look at the development of drugs, the cost and time that it takes to develop drugs to get them to market has grown almost exponentially. And that's not good for patients. It's not good for populations. It's not good for healthcare payers. And so Lindus Health approached me very early in their development, asking for advice on how we could help engage primary care in research and how we could make participant engagement easier and more egalitarian. And Lindus Health was set up largely to solve the problems of healthcare experience and sponsor experience with trial development. So the two founders of Lindus, the two co-founders, had both been heavily involved in investment in research or delivering it from a government point of view, but also they'd been participants in clinical trials. And they found that the way that current CROs are set up doesn't help as much as it could necessarily the delivery of clinical research. And so they chose to develop Lindus Health and be an anti-CRO. And that means doing things differently. And one of the things we do is that we tend to focus on a largely fixed price model for a clinical trial to give sponsors certainty. But by focusing on that rather than a sort of cost plus model, you're able to use different incentives. You're able to use different approaches. And we've developed our own in-house EDC and IT systems to help us run trials more efficiently and more effectively. We've also, right from the development of Lindus Health, focused on the participant experience. And how do you get good representation in clinical trials? How do you get people engaged in clinical trials so that you can rapidly recruit them, but also give back to the communities, get the medicines out there as quickly as possible in the communities that really need them. So that has been sort of fundamental philosophy of Lindus right from the beginning. And one of the things that Lindus has done is deliver clinical trials with that sort of participant focus right from our first trials onwards. I've been involved in a range of clinical trials, predominantly focused around my clinical practice and my clinical interests. So that's been chronic disease, diabetes, metabolic health, dermatology, and other common presentations within primary care, within the community care.
And were those personal interests, or did it just develop out of your practice?
Um, I've always had a personal interest in diabetes care. It runs in my family for a start,
Mm.
and I've seen within primary care, I've seen that diabetes care was often undervalued, ineffectively done care delivery. We were fortunate in the UK that with the implementation of the quality outcomes framework back in the early 2000s, that diabetes started to have more of a focus, particularly in primary care. And that has definitely had a help. It improved the quality of the care for a lot of participants within primary care and has been quite a substantial driver for change. But diabetes is burgeoning and obesity is burgeoning, and we need to keep pace with that. And it is a very substantial workload, a very big impact on patients' lives and on patients' long-term health. And that is why it's a key interest of mine.
How does the overrepresentation of white participants in industry-funded studies impact diabetes treatments for diverse populations?
So it's not just diabetes trials, I hasten to add, it's all
Right,
trials.
right. But
Um,
we're speaking
and
specifically
and
about
it's
this
it's
one.
both commercial and academic trials. So
Ah, okay.
diabetes is everybody recognizes that there is huge underrepresentation of key groups within diabetes. And so you've got diabetes being disproportionately present in certain ethnic minorities, and yet you've got underrepresentation of those groups within clinical trials. So you've got two effects there. One is the fact that the disease prevalence is actually much higher in certain ethnic and racial groups, but also those groups are then massively underrepresented within the trial populations, and that has a huge knock-on effect because we know that not only are they underrepresented from a disease point of view, but we also know that they experience poorer care. So the markers of care are, for example, albuminuria or variability in glucose management, things like that. Retinopathy are worse in ethnic minorities. And we know that the complications of diabetes are higher in those populations as well. So not only is the disease representation low, but they actually have a disproportionately high burden of complications. The research is there that to a point, we know that that happens. There is a lot of debate over the factors behind it. We know, for example, in South Asian populations, their insulin resistance onset is at a much younger age, and we know that if you look at genetic studies, if you look at South Asian populations and compare that with white European populations, some studies have shown there's a fourfold difference in their chances of developing diabetes, for example. So there's definitely a genetic component, but that's sometimes quite difficult to unravel from other factors that may also be present, such as socioeconomic, education, access to healthcare, and insurance coverage and things like that. And so often this is pointed out as a political issue. It isn't. It is definitely a medical issue, and we need to solve it from a medical point of view. And that starts with getting people involved in clinical trials.
Um, have you seen a change? I know that type 2 diabetes pops up as one of the top exclusion criteria for clinical trials. Do you see that changing? Like, if the diabetes is managed, have you seen that changing?
So inclusion and exclusion criteria are often a barrier, and um, you can, to some extent, you can understand it. The problem is that it doesn't actually end up reflecting the target population because from a pure science point of view, you want to be able to see a definitive signal without complicating factors that might cause confounding information being present. But the problem is particularly with early trials, if you exclude those populations who are going to end up being target populations for your drug, you may either overestimate or even worse, potentially underestimate the impact of a drug within a particular population. And then you then may not progress that drug, for example. And so if you don't align your target populations with your recruited top populations, you're not going to get good science in the long run. So yes, it may make the original trial slightly harder to do. It may make it slightly more complicated, but actually the end result and the quality of the science you get as a result is going to be better in the long run.
So, what are some of the primary barriers that prevent marginalized communities from participating in diabetes clinical trials?
So there are numerous, and what one of the things my colleagues did within Lindus Health is they were involved in a piece of research working with Oxford University, looking specifically at this, looking at barriers to involvement in clinical trials, and they did this on a three-phase approach. They had a literature search, they then did a series of surveys, and they then did some focus groups. And there were sort of 8 key things that came out of that. For people to engage with the clinical trials, they had to see the relevance of the trial. They had to understand the safety of the trial. They had to feel that they were adequately supported and that it was perceived by others. They had to have the appropriate monetary compensation. They had to trust the trial sponsor. They had to have suitable convenience to be involved in the trial, and they had to be aware of the clinical trials and their outcomes and benefits generally. And then the final factor that was also important was the source of the recommendation or the source of the referral. So if you take that in a simple way, if you look at, for example, rural populations, and I did a lot of my early general practice working in quite rural populations, that's very different from a research center population that's 500 meters from a research center. If you've got a 40-minute or 2-hour bus drive to get to the research center and 15 minutes at the research center and then another 40-minute or hour or whatever it is bus drive back, that is very much more inconvenient than if you've got a 500-meter walk down to that same research center. And so if you've got a rural population, you may have to think differently about how you deliver that trial. And you could say then, okay, well, how do we minimize the amount of times that they have to visit the center? Or could we do this, for example, completely decentralized? Now, that may require you to look at different endpoints. So, is a continuous glucose monitor going to be an effective endpoint rather than a glucose level? Is a continuous blood pressure monitor going to be a more effective route rather than a single blood pressure reading in a clinical center? So there are ways that you can design trials to help break down those barriers. We're doing a trial at the moment with Actia, which is a continuous blood pressure monitor. And I can see the potential to use that in trials in the future. And the quality of the results you get from that, that is a continuous blood pressure. And so there are different ways you can think about trial endpoints to facilitate and break down barriers. The key thing is looking at the target population, looking at the trial, and making sure that you actually take the time and effort to think about the potential barriers and then how you're going to address each one of those individually for that specific trial. It's not a one size fits all. So the other side, for example, is the fact that our research centers, where we have physical centers and our networks, we often have prioritized urban centers with high ethnic minority mix, so that we can guarantee that we can get good recruitment within those ethnicities if we've got a physical site requirement. So it is very much about designing the trial and looking at the individual barriers for that trial and making sure that you actually proactively address them.
Can you share any initiatives Lindus Health is implementing to improve trial access for underrepresented groups? I know you touched on some of it. You said urban centers and designed to address access, but how specifically?
So I think it's probably helpful to to go back to how we think about it, um, we start right at the beginning. In every single aspect of the trial, we think about diversity as a key thing. So part of solving the problem is actually putting it on the agenda in the first place and making sure that every time you look at something in a trial, you think, how will this impact the diversity of the trial? So there isn't one single thing that we ever do that solves diversity. You have to address multiple barriers. So for start, we gain a better understanding of the populations that we're trying to target and engage. We have a patient advisory board. We work closely with patient advocacy, with faith groups, and with community leaders. We have a multi-channel recruitment approach. We translate patient materials. We have a diverse network within our primary care group that I've talked about to make sure. And one of the ways we deal with that is we look at their target population, so we know the demographics of our network. We look at capturing the demographic data as the trial goes on, and we monitor that on a live basis. So we can then adjust our approach. For example, if we were seeing that we weren't having adequate numbers of a particular ethnic group in there, we could actually bring on board another of our network to facilitate that, or we could change the social media advertising to specifically target certain subgroups to make sure that we'd actually get people coming in at the top of that recruitment funnel to address that issue.
I imagine that efforts in rural areas are probably going to be a little different from urban centers.
Yeah, and I think we work very closely with our network. We have got rural practices in our networks, and we make sure that, for example, we will deliberately include rural practices in our network. They may not be the most efficient way of doing it from a pure recruitment point of view. If you're looking at, how do you recruit 100 people or 500 people in a trial, you would say, oh, okay, let's focus our efforts on the big centers that can recruit, 30 patients or 50 patients for each of us. We actually don't just take that approach. We say, okay, so who within our network are we going to go out to make sure that we get proper representation? And we will include some of the rural areas deliberately to make sure that we actually are able to support them and bring them on board. We know that, they often are smaller practices, they're often smaller groups. It's less efficient, but it's important. And so it is about actually proactively managing that and saying, okay, how are we going to address this within a trial? Who within our network are we going to offer this trial to make sure that we actually adequately meet the needs of that target population?
Have you found underrepresented communities to be hesitant about participating in clinical trials?
There's always an initial barrier, but if you engage them, our experience has been universal acceptance and, in fact, enthusiasm. If you can get a community leader on board, or if you can get somebody within the community who's going to advocate, that actually is one of the strongest drivers you can possibly get. And so people, the research that my colleagues did showed that actually the willingness to be involved in clinical trials is universal. There's very little difference between the sort of different ethnic groups we looked at in terms of their willingness to be involved in trials. The key thing is you have to make the effort to engage them, and when you do, they engage. It's not a one-off process, though. There are things that you need to address in the longer term, and part of that is about feedback and demonstrating to those communities that the research was valuable and that their contribution was valuable. And then that becomes an iterative process, because that then raises the awareness, the interest, and the enthusiasm for future trials.
Can you discuss the role of partnerships with local healthcare providers in making clinical trials more accessible and inclusive?
Local partners are absolutely key, and we put the time and effort into building those relationships and maintaining those relationships. As you would expect with me coming from a primary care background, I've I've worked in my primary care life. I've worked in rural communities. I've worked in communities with very high ethnic minority mix. I've worked in deprived communities, and that's true for my colleagues as well. And it's absolutely essential that you build networks and build that rapport. Um, Patients trust their clinicians by and large, and we know very well that if you get an invite from your GP saying, "Would you like to be involved in the research?" their patients are far more likely to be interested in that than they would if they just got some generic text message from a mass outreach. And so we build our networks with our local partners. We support our local partners. We make sure that they are adequately funded to do the research because it needs to be a sustainable business model for them. And we, for example, we help write the searches for them so that they have less work to do. We will support them with materials. We'll support them with everything that they need to make it as easy as possible. But we then rely on them to deliver that message, that personal message to their patient population. And we've spent a lot of time and effort within Lindus building up a network of participants of local healthcare providers because we fundamentally believe that local relationship is absolutely key, whether it's recruitment alone or whether it's actually delivering clinical research as a site. Those relationships are absolutely key.
In what ways do inclusive clinical trials contribute to advancing healthcare equity, especially in diabetes treatment?
So there are so many unanswered questions in diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
As I touched on earlier, people still can't agree how much genetics and ethnicity and race play into the different risk factors. But we do know there is a genetic component, and it's absolutely key that those underrepresented populations get involved in the research so that we understand more. But I see this as a longer term journey. We know that race and ethnicity in particular impacts how you deal with particular pharmacology and your risk factors. And in medicine generally, we are moving towards more personalized healthcare. If you take oncology, for example, Herceptin, HER2 positive breast cancer, absolutely targeted. And you've got broader targets in hypertension, for example, where the first drug that you start for a hypertensive varies based on their age and their race. That's not quite so prevalent in diabetes because the evidence isn't there for it yet. It may be, for example, that we need different thresholds for GLP-1s in South Asian population, heredity. It may be that you have a different starting drug. The problem is we don't know, and we need a lot more research from those underrepresented populations to be able to give us the information, not just about how we design the care pathways, but also potentially different health economics based on a participant's genetics. So it will potentially impact how a payer decides to remunerate or design a particular care pathway.
If I could, I just wanted to circle back to the previous question about local healthcare providers. You said that you provide them with written materials. Do you provide them with any support in terms of having these discussions with patients and what patients would be the ideal candidates? How does that work?
So, in a simple answer, yes, we do. We are always available for our networks. Obviously, you've got the traditional medical monitor role where the medical monitor helps support inclusion and exclusion criteria. We actually take it a step further. We sometimes, for example, provide our own nurses to the site. We sometimes provide our own doctors to the site to help support the site. We will have very focused and supportive site initiation visits, for example, where we don't just regurgitate what's in the protocol. We actually design the site initiation visit around the needs of that site. So it's focused on the challenges that they may face, the questions that they may have, the support that they may need. And then we come away from that site initiation visit with a plan for supporting that individual site.
The reason I asked is because I've read that doctors have cited one of the reasons they don't refer their patients for clinical trials is because they don't know enough about the drug.
So that's one of the key things. So within the site initiation visits, we spend a lot of time discussing the trial itself, and we encourage the doctors at the site to, for example, ask us questions. We'll say okay, so what do you think might come up? What questions do you think might need answering? And we'll make sure that we either provide that on the site initiation visit call, or we come back to them later with further information that they need to make sure that they're in as strong a position as possible to answer all the potential queries and help address the barriers that patients may perceive that are either there or not to them enrolling in the trial. We're there to make sure that the site clinicians are as well supported as possible so that they can be our advocates in the community. Obviously, they need to present fair and factual information, but we need to make sure that they have it to their fingertips, so that they can pass that along, and so that participants or potential participants can be really well informed when they get involved in a trial.
So what challenges have you encountered in your efforts to diversify clinical trial participation, and how have you addressed them?
Diversity is always a challenge, has been for a long time. It is increasingly getting addressed, but the key thing that you have to do is make sure it is on the agenda at every step of the way. If you don't ask the question, you won't get the answer. That's a sort of mental shift that then drives practical changes within your trial delivery. One very tangible example would be one of the things that emerged from the research with Oxford was that there is a different perception of stipends for between different ethnic groups. And so when we're discussing with sponsors or with ethics committees about a patient stipend for involvement in the trial, we can point to solid evidence that says, okay, the reason we've picked this level of stipend, or the reason we're recommending this level of stipend, is because we want to make sure that we're targeting a diverse population and having proper representation in the trial, and that actually, if you don't put this at an adequate level, that it's going to be perceived in the right way, you won't get the ethnic minorities in the trial in the way that you want to potentially. And there are many different reasons why the stipend may be more important. It may be, for example, it's not actually ethnicity or race, it's the fact that actually those populations happen to be poorer. And if you're already working 3 jobs and you can't afford to take the time off, you've got to pay the bills. And therefore, if you want to have that time to take out and do research, you have to be remunerated for it. That's a very different proposition from somebody who's got the time to be able to say, oh, actually, I don't need to go into work today. Work will give me the time off for free, because I'm doing trial stuff. And so there are myriads of reasons why that happens, but we're able to point to the evidence that actually a reasonable, justifiable level of stipend will have a massive impact.
Well, it's interesting that you said that, because I spoke to, several months ago, I spoke to someone who does clinical trial research, and he said that the prevailing sentiment among clinical trial researchers is that it's more expensive to recruit diverse patients than it is to recruit non-diverse patients for clinical trials. Do you want to talk about that a little? I mean, you did talk about that a little bit. There's also the issue of childcare and paying for the childcare, or, if somebody has to stay home to take care of the child for the participant in
Mhm.
the clinical trial, then they've lost their income. And so, yeah, that speaks to what you were just talking about in terms of requiring a higher stipend. But can you talk about the idea that it's more expensive and therefore not worth the effort?
I mean, firstly, I haven't looked at that particular research myself. Um, I would challenge that it's not worth the effort because
Oh, I
ultimately,
agree with you that I would also challenge that, but I'm asking you your expert opinion
um,
to challenge.
it's it's not been our finding, to be honest, that it's been more expensive. It's um, I think if you're often not talking huge differences in stipend costs, and those are often more than offset by your speed of recruitment. So it ironically may be sometimes cheaper to offer a higher stipend and get
Ah,
faster recruitment than it would be to say, oh, actually, there's no stipend here, and recruitment is then much longer. So our experience has not been the case that they cite. I think the other thing is that you also have to look at not just recruitment, you also have to look at retention. And if you get engaged individuals, doesn't matter what um, group from society they come from, but if they're engaged, they're going to stick the course. And we've got very, very good retention within our trials. And part of that is because we think about the entire patient journey. We engage with participants. We work out the barriers for keeping them within the trial, of which stipend may be one, but it's not the only thing. It's about, how you design, for example, can this be done by a remote ePro or do they need to come into the clinic? So it's not just about the stipend. But I think that our experience has not been that it's more expensive to recruit from ethnic minorities. That's not something we've seen.
what percentage of your patients that participate in your clinical trials would you consider diverse?
Um, it
Ballpark.
varies. It varies from trial to trial. That's not. Um, I can get you the data. I haven't got it to my fingertips.
That's okay.
Um, I, I just my ballpark figures would be that we recruit either to the population or possibly slightly overrepresent ethnic minorities because obviously you've got, from a statistical point of view, you've got to overrepresent an ethnic minority potentially to have a valid sample size. Um, we haven't had a problem recruiting to trials because we think about it right from the beginning, and we make sure that we address it. But yeah, I can get you those figures and revert back if that's all right.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. What steps can the wider medical and pharmaceutical industries take to ensure that future diabetes treatments are effective for everyone?
I think conversation is the first part. It's actually putting it on the agenda, and it's frustrating to say, that in this day and age we're still discussing it as an issue, but it is, and
Yeah.
and therefore we just need to keep raising it up the agenda, and that's one of the reasons why Lindus has done the research. One of the reasons why I'm here today is because we're passionate about it. We have to create drugs. We have to get drugs to market that are suitable for the populations that are going to take them. And the only way you can do that is by making sure that the populations are truly represented in the trials. So it's every clinician, it's every researcher, it's every sponsor actually being an advocate for that approach, rather than saying, "Oh, it's going to be too expensive, it's not effective, it's not a focus of mine." And I think one of the key things is that we know that there's underrepresentation in clinical trials, but that is particularly marked in early stage trials. And the early stage trials are what sets out whether the drug is going to even get progressed or not. And so if you're underrepresenting people in those trials, your subsequent trials are not going to be designed or as effective as they could be if you'd had a true representative population. So we really need to focus not just on underrepresentation, but actually particularly on those early phase trials, because that sets the agenda for the rest of that drug's development or devices development.
So when you say focus on early stage trials, what does that mean exactly?
So phase one, early phase twos.
Mm-hmm.
We know that there is a more acute underrepresentation problem in those trial areas, and it's not just limited to drugs. We know, for example, that as the wider medical profession began to realize during COVID, if you take pulse oximeters, for example, pulse
Mm-hmm.
oximeters are not as effective in people with darker skin. They're
Right.
not as reliable. And had there been earlier involvement, had there been more representative involvement in clinical trials, we hopefully wouldn't have got to that situation.
So just so I understand, focus on early stage trials means baking in from the very beginning
Mhm.
diversity so that you don't have a drug that say passes phase one and then you find out at phase two, uh-oh, this is not really working for a diverse population. Is that that's my understand, my
Yeah,
understanding that?
and conversely, making sure that you don't reject in the early phases drugs that might actually be effective in minority populations. Because what if you've missed out a whole tranche of
Oh,
people where the drug is really effective, you may end up not developing a drug, not progressing that drug with the same priority, or even not progressing it at all. Where actually, if you'd
oh.
had a diverse population, it would have been progressed differently. So it can work both ways.
How do you see the landscape of diabetes treatment evolving as clinical trials become more inclusive and representative of the general population?
So I think it comes back to the earlier issues around bespoke personalized medicine.
Hmm.
Um, I, I think that's probably going to be the biggest transformation that we see over the next 25 years, is that medicine is going to be far more targeted, particularly in Western medicine, where the healthcare organizations can afford that level of bespoke design. But that hopefully will filter down to all healthcare populations. It's
Oh,
about ensuring. Sorry,
well, I was going to say bespoke, that sounds expensive.
it,
Can you?
it's it can be, but it
Mhm.
also can be cost effective. If you take and I'll go back to the Herceptin issue. If you, for example, tried treating all breast cancer with Herceptin, and it's totally ineffective, or not totally ineffective, but very, very, significantly less effective in patients who are non-HER2 positive,
Mhm.
then you end up providing an expensive drug to people who are going to get no benefit from it. And that's a waste of money. Whereas by knowing that you need to target it to HER2 populations, HER2 positive populations, you actually make that drug far more cost effective. So if you start providing personalized medicine, there is, particularly for the more expensive drugs, you actually start using that drug far more effectively and in a far more targeted way that actually brings down its health economic costs.
Well, I wonder who's making that case because it feels like we have a situation where clinicians are hesitant to prescribe what you call bespoke to marginalized or people they consider lower income because they don't think their insurance is going to pay for it. Because clinicians have said we prescribe basically what we think the insurance is going to pay for.
Yeah. I think that comes down to, again, the inclusion, because if you've got the evidence base in clinical trials that it's a cost-effective intervention in a particular group, that enables the payer to authorize it. And I think that's the key thing, which is getting participants involved and making sure that you've then got the evidence for the effectiveness in that group of individuals. And that then feeds into the health economics and the payer decisions.
Hmm. Okay, that sounds very optimistic.
I, it, yeah, it may be a little optimistic, but I think the costs of applying personalized medicine are going to be coming down quite significantly in the future. But I think we're already starting to see it in guidelines, and it's because increasingly papers are filtering through that are providing evidence to say, actually, this subgroup has more benefit or less benefit than others, and therefore you should be using or not using that drug within that subgroup. And it takes a while for guidelines to change. It takes a while for things, but it may be, for example, you know, the evidence comes out and says it's cost effective to use GLP-1s in South Asian populations 15 years earlier than it would be for a white population because of the level of disease and the level of complications that they then inherit further down the line. But you need the research evidence first before you can do anything else. Without the evidence, an insurer or payer, whether it's a National Health Service or whether it's a commercial insurer, is not going to change their policies. So it has to be evidence-based.
Well, to your point, clinicians had said for years that people of color needed to be screened earlier for colorectal cancers. And for years, the task force, USPSTF, ignored those guidelines. And only in the past few years, finally made it an across-the-board decision to lower the age. But the cry from the clinical community had been going on for years and years and years before that.
There is always institutional inertia. I think the pace is changing though. And I noticed, for example, in the American diabetes guidelines, that actually race is a risk factor now for screening. And very welcome too, because the evidence points to that being a factor. So it is starting to be embedded into guidelines. But the key thing is, if you have the evidence, people find it a lot harder to argue against it. If you don't have the evidence, then it becomes gut instinct or anecdote, and it's a lot easier to argue against it. And that's why it's absolutely key that we get proper representation in clinical trials, so that we can provide the decision makers with solid evidence that says this is where this drug is effective, this is where it's going to be cost effective, this is where we should be using it, and that we get really good, effective medicines to market that are going to work within the populations that need them.
From your lips to the clinical God's ears. Dr. Luke Twells, thank you so much for today, and thank you for your work in the clinical trial diabetes space, and looking forward to more diversity in clinical trials with your efforts.
Absolutely, and it's on every clinician, it's on every researcher. It's not. We all have a responsibility.